I'm Michael Dumas. I'm assistant professor in the Graduate School of Education and the Department of African American Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. I've actually authored two recent pieces that relate to an understanding of black young men and boys in the United States. And both of them are focused, well, the first is actually focused primarily on the My Brother's Keeper policy. And it's actually a critique of My Brother's Keeper as what I understand as an instantiation of neoliberal governmentality. That is to say that embedded deeply in My Brother's Keeper is an understanding of black males as problem, and the solution to those problems are rooted in certain kinds of technical or technicist kinds of interventions that could be provided that would somehow make them better able to somehow succeed in the market. When we construct black boys as problem, then our interventions follow from that. Policy proposals are a result of what we understand the problem to be. And so in this case, the problem for black males is perceived to be their own behavioral maladjustments or their inability to delay gratification. So all these kinds of behavioral or cultural explanations for educational disparities. So once we understand the problem as somehow rooted in their own lack of motivation or their lack of access to certain kinds of capital, social capital, then the intervention then is really focused primarily around giving them access to what we call mentorship as a form of social capital. But mentorship programs for black males are different than they are for a lot of other populations because they're focused so much around self-regulation. So rather than the focus being on giving them access to actual material resources, it's mostly around finding a mentor who can help you to stay focused or to delay gratification, a kind of inspirational figure who might be able to help you apply to college, but it's primarily that the problem is constructed as that you just don't try hard enough. So let me say this. In introducing My Brother's Keeper, the President Obama, focused primarily on black boys as having these problems. So in one of his first talks about this with young people in the room, it's a town hall, and there are young people in the room, and he says, "I'm just like you. I was just like you as a young boy. I often didn't study hard enough. I smoked too much weed, and I wasn't as dedicated to my studies." And so, in even constructing it that way, in the sense of I'm just like you, this is who you are. You are these boys with problems, and therefore we have this new intervention, My Brother's Keeper, which is meant to address those problems. And he did not give much attention to the structural, the economic constraints that would have actually limited the life chances of these boys. He gave some nod to that, as many people do, but then quickly returned to the main construction of the problem, which is really something within the bodies of those boys, a certain lack of motivation, a certain lack of desire. So I kind of critique My Brother's Keeper on that count. In another recent piece co-authored with Joseph Nelson that appears in the Harvard Educational Review, we look at the problem of the unimaginability of black boyhood. So what we argue in that piece is that due to the kind of crisis language around black males, which is so preoccupied with adulthood and what's going to happen years hence and what kind of problems that's going to create for the market or for society. So again, this preoccupation with black males as problem then makes it impossible to think about black boyhood as even existing. And by boyhood, I mean this kind of state of childhood in which we aren't really necessarily, we're more concerned with, are you growing? Are you creative? Are you happy now? Are you giggling? Are you silly now? No, there's no time for black boys to be silly or to giggle because we are so preoccupied with these worries, these concerns about what they're going to become in adulthood. So it's partly the crisis language around black males, but it's also just about the impossibility of black childhood more generally for both black boys and girls. So I make mention in the article about how during the days of slavery, black children as early as 2 and 3, as young as 2 and 3, were put to work gathering sticks for kindling. And from then on, it was a life of work. So it was never imagined that there was any time that play was something that black children would have access to. And so what we're trying to do in that piece is to insist on understanding black boys as children and and childhood as this thing that needs to be understood as a social location that is worth itself for itself, not this idea of children as somehow not yet something else, and we have to worry about what is not yet. And we would argue that for most white children, that's allowed. In many cases, white children get to be children well into their 20s. We still view them as young, whereas for black children, then that childhood is often not allowed. So the piece begins with reference to Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old boy in Cleveland who was shot by and killed by a white police officer who believed that Tamir may have been 20, even though he was only 12. And thus, as a 12-year-old, if you think it's a 12-year-old with a gun, then you would imagine it's probably a toy gun. If you believe it's a 20-year-old, then of course, then it's this threat. So this 12-year-old boy became a threat and was killed as a result of that. And so again, the consequences of imagining black boys as men or as adults are, in this case, deadly.